Well, good morning, folks. It's good to have you out bright and early here in New York, New York. Welcome to the Age Society. And to our trustees, one and all who are here, thank you for being with us. I appreciate that very much. We're privileged today to have a guy, or as we would say in Australia, a bloke, who I've known for about 20 years, Bruce Stokes. Bruce is a formidable analyst of, let's call it, global public opinion. And through his formidable work with the Pew Research Centre, in my judgment, around the world, has the best set of continuing longitudinal research of public attitude surveys of domestic opinion within key countries about other countries and about the world and about themselves. And it is an invaluable resource to explain how, in fact, various governments around the world shape their own policies. Until recent times, he also, within a few constraints, was able to undertake similar research within China. And so what I know from the Chinese system over the years is that despite it being run by an authoritarian state, even the Chinese system itself undertakes regular confidential internal polling to understand, in fact, what the parameters are for its own policy actions in China abroad and China at home. But in this day and age when the world is looking carefully at the United States under President Trump, China's Xi Jinping, and where this core relationship goes in the future, how global public opinion in Europe, in the United States, in Asia, looks at these two countries and their two leaders today matters. It helps shape the political and policy space within which the governments of those key countries operate. I first met Bruce Stokes about 20 years ago in Australia. I think we were a part of the Australia-US Leadership Dialogue, and which was a group set up 25 years ago. And both Bruce and I agreed this morning that neither of us have changed one bit since then. So, which proves that cosmetic surgery works, at least in my case. But over that period of time, I've been the beneficiary of so many presentations from Bruce. And when I really enjoy them is that when they confirm every single political and foreign policy prejudice I've got. And then, equally, you find data sets which confound you, which challenge you in terms of assumptions you really thought were well grounded in fact. And as someone who's been in my country's domestic politics for more years than I care to remember, politicians also pay careful account to not just an individual survey, but what they tell you over time. I did say to Bruce before he came in, the only data set of which I've ever disapproved, of which he's done, was when he found a data set when I was in office in Australia, and he did not find me to be universally popular. So I said that was his single inaccurate finding. But he's corrected that data set since, so I appreciate it very much. Bruce, you're a welcome guest here at the Age Society. For those of you who are with us this morning who are trustees, and those of you who come from outside the building and joined us for this presentation, you know we have a rolling series of events here. You know what we do at the Age Society Policy Institute, of which I'm president. And you know what we're currently doing in the arts side of the house with this extraordinary exhibition of post-independence Indian painting. And I'd strongly commend those of you who've not seen the exhibition yet to go and take a close look. So what's going to happen this morning is Bruce is going to give us 15 to 20 minutes, I think, Bruce, on the slideshow. He will explain the world in 20 minutes, and then I will interrogate him and look at what the data is saying, and then we open it to Q&A. Please welcome Bruce Stokes.
Thanks, Kevin, and it's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here, and thank Wendy Cutler for inviting me. I think Wendy and I may actually know each other longer than Kevin and I know each other, back from her old USTR days and my days as a trade journalist. And so it's a real pleasure to be with you to share some of this data. But what I really enjoy about these kind of interactions is the questions that people pose, your interpretations of the data. So I look forward to vigorous Q&A. A little bit of background for those of you who don't know, the Pew Research Center is based in Washington. We've been around since the 90s. We do public opinion research in the U.S. and since the early part of this century all over the world. All of the data that well, actually, I should mention one other thing. We're funded by the Pew Charitable Trust, which, as you know, is a Philadelphia-based foundation that, as I like to joke, has the quaint idea that good public policy flows from good information. I say quaint because we aren't so sure that applies in many cases anymore, but they firmly believe that we need to do and understand what the public is thinking, and so they have funded us now very generously for years to do public opinion research on a whole range of issues, not just what I'm going to share with you. On our website, there's data about Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans and religion issues all over the world and various social issues, a lot of political polling in the United States. And the most important thing is the stuff I'm going to share with you is all on our website, and it's free, but most importantly, it's searchable. So if you say, well, gee, what did the Indonesians think in 2004 about the United States? That data's there. So there's a lot of information, and not just thumbs up, thumbs down about the U.S. president or the United States, but on a whole range of issues on trade, on various social issues. We have a wonderful data set we're coming out with later this year on people's sense of identity or their lack of a sense of identity around the world. Do they feel the relationship between the sexes are changing? Is that good or bad? Or is the diversity of their country changing? Is that good or bad? Is their religious life changing? Is that good or bad? Because we firmly believe that while many of us work on economics and believe that economics maybe, it's the economy stupid, that increasingly the issues of identity may explain a lot of what's going on in various societies. So there's a lot of information I think that you might find of interest. Maybe we can turn down the lights a little bit, make it a little easier to see. This is this year's set of countries that we surveyed, and the findings that we had for whether the U.S. is seen favorably or unfavorably. And it was a simple question. Do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of the United States? As you can see in Asia, there's a much stronger favorability to the U.S. across the board in most countries than, say, in many countries in Europe. 2/3 of the Japanese have a positive view of the United States. That's actually up 10 points from last year. 80% of South Koreans have a positive view of the United States. That's up 6 points from last year. The Filipinos are very strongly supportive of the United States. Indonesians less so, and it's down 6 points from last year. Australians, a little over half, have a positive view of the U.S., and that's actually up 6 points in the last year. But Israel up 2 points since last year, very strong support, maybe the strongest in the world. France only 38%, Netherlands only 34%, Germany only 30%. So it does, I would say in general, Europeans are much less favorably disposed to the U.S. than our Asians. This is a breakdown by country of the Asian data on President Trump. The question we ask and have asked for many years is, do you have confidence in the U.S. president, whoever that might be, Bush, Obama, and then Trump, in his handling of world affairs? And as you can see, only 30% of the Japanese have confidence in President Trump. 2/3 have no confidence. That 30% in Japan is actually up 6 percentage points from last year. The South Korean confidence is up 22 percentage points. And so I think if you marry the rise in confidence in the U.S. president, especially in South Korea, with a slightly increased favorability of the U.S., you have to conclude it's because the people in Japan and South Korea believe that the U.S. is at least trying to address what we know to be from our other surveys, the one big problem that both those countries share, which is North Korea. We can just debate whether it's a meaningful engagement, whether it's going to lead to anything, but let's be honest with ourselves. Average people just want somebody to look like they're doing something. and they probably don't understand the details. Favorability of the U.S. president's up 9 points in the Philippines. So again, across Asia, a slight increase in confidence in the U.S. president. By the way, it's up 13 percentage points in Israel, which we largely attribute to the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem. Notice, though, 6% confidence in the U.S. president in Mexico. It's up 1 percentage point from last year. It was 5 last year. But Gallup has found the same thing. Lowest favorability and lowest confidence in the U.S. president in Mexico in the history of both the Gallup polls and our polls. Just to give you a historical view in one Asian country, in Japan, what you see, and this is a pattern you see in most parts of the world, the view of the U.S. president and the confidence in the U.S. president and favorability of the U.S. tend to track each other. When one goes up, the other goes up. When one goes down, the other goes down. And the favorability of the U.S. tends to be less variable than the confidence in the U.S. president. So even though you had a collapse in Japanese confidence in the U.S. president from 2016 to 2017, from 78% to 24%, bear in mind it was only 25% in the last year of the Bush administration, went up to 85% with Obama. So these things do tend to vary, but right now we're stuck at a very low point in Japan. This gives you a sense of another question that we've asked periodically, and it's a sense of, do people believe the United States acts unilaterally in the conduct of U.S. foreign policy? And the problem with that kind of question to the public is, if you ask people about unilateralism, they wouldn't know what you meant. So we tried to shape a question that said, in making international policy decisions, does the U.S. take into account the interest of countries like yours when it makes U.S. foreign policy? And as you can see, in 2013, for example, in Indonesia, 52% of people said, yes, the U.S. takes into account the interest of Indonesia when it makes U.S. foreign policy. I'm not sure why anybody says that, but I don't know. I would say that, but it's just the way it is. But it's dropped 13 percentage points since 2013. In South Korea, it's dropped 12 percentage points. In the Philippines, it's very high, but it's down 11 percentage points. So there is a sense, not only in Asia, but across the world, that the U.S. is acting more unilaterally today than it did 5 years ago. So the perception of the U.S. as being not as engaged with us as a nation seems to be growing. We asked this year a question, compared with a few years ago, is the U.S. doing more or less to help address major global problems? Now, limitation of a question like this is you don't know which global problem the respondent was hearing or thinking when you ask them the question. And bear in mind, these are average people in all of these countries. On the other hand, we did last year ask people about a series of signature Trump administration policies. And overwhelmingly across the world, people were against the U.S. getting out of trade agreements, against the U.S. getting out of the climate change agreement, against the U.S. getting out of the Iran Accord, against the U.S. building a wall on the border with Mexico, against the U.S. banning Muslims. So I think it's safe to say that that's a gamut of global problems. And what you can see is that a plurality of Australians say that the U.S. is doing less with global problems than it did in the past. A plurality of the Japanese believe that. Koreans are divided on that issue. And in Indonesia and the Philippines, basically a majority or half the people say it's about the same as it was last year. Notice the Canadians overwhelmingly believe that the U.S. is doing less. We also ask about China in this survey and have for many years. And this is comparing the median view in 25 countries, which is the number of countries we surveyed this year. Favorable, unfavorable views of China versus favorable, unfavorable views of the U.S. People have a slightly more favorable view of the U.S. globally, but regionally there are real differences. We ask people who plays a more important role in the world today compared to 10 years ago. 31% of the people in the 25 countries say it's the U.S. 70% say it's China. So I think there's a strong recognition that China plays a more important role than it does 10 years ago. And that's not saying that they play a more important role in the U.S. It's just that they play a more important role than they did 10 years ago. We ask people every year, who's the world's leading economic power? This year, people say it's the United States. I can tell you at the depths of the recession, they said it was China. So this is a question where the response varies year to year almost, depending on kind of economic perception of the two economic powers. What is interesting is that given the very low favorability of the U.S. and the confidence in the U.S. president, especially in Europe, but also in Latin America, and the mixed results in Asia, when you posit to the global public, well, who would you like to be the leading world power, China or the United States? So it's one or the other. You can't say your own country, you can't say Europe, you can't say Japan. Basically, overwhelmingly still people say we would like the U.S. to be the world's leading. And remember, this is after we've asked them, they've said, oh, the U.S. is acting more unilaterally, the U.S. is not engaged in global problem solving the way it used to be. Nevertheless, if we have to choose, we would prefer the United States over China. A couple of other questions on U.S. soft power. This is a question we've asked periodically. Who respects the personal freedoms of its own people? Half the public says the U.S. Only 1 in 5 people say China respects the personal freedoms of its own people. I can tell you, though, that this soft power indicator in Europe in particular has collapsed. For years, it was about 3/4 of Europeans said America respects the personal freedoms of its own people. Then you had the NSA scandal. Then you had Black Lives Matter in Ferguson. And then you had Trump. And basically, from a European perspective, it's just gone downhill. And now less than half, only about 1/3 to 40% of Europeans, depending on the country, say that the U.S. protects the personal freedoms of its own people. So you can do damage to your soft power. And remember, that damage started under Obama, not just Trump. This is this question on the world's leading economic power. Basically, it's the South Koreans and the Japanese who are most likely to say that the U.S. is the world's leading economic power. But notice that in Europe, and in Africa, Canada even, people say China is the world's leading economic power. The Germans, half of Germans say that China is the world's leading economic power. Notice that no one said Europe and Japan are the world's leading economic power. Although I love the fact that 21% of Germans said the EU was the world's leading economic power. And that's like 4 or 5 times what anybody else says about Europe. And you got to believe the Germans were thinking, well, when we say Europe, we really mean Germany. This is that response to that question, who would be better leading the world? Asians, by very large majorities, say that they would prefer U.S. leadership over Chinese leadership. Finally, and just very briefly, we ask a series of questions in the U.S. about trade. Because trade's such an important issue, I wanted to share some of this with you. The responses you get on trade in America, and actually all over the world, really depend on how general or specific the question is. We have asked consistently, is trade and growing business ties with the rest of the world a good or bad thing for the United States? And as you can see, strong majorities, this year 74% of Americans say yes, it's good for the country. So in principle, we've drunk the Kool-Aid. We kind of see this as the norm, and we accept that it's okay, good for the U.S. If you ask a more specific question, do you want your government to sign more free trade agreements that will open the U.S. domestic market to greater foreign competition, then you only get about half, 56% this year, who say yes. So again, more specific question, you get a more nuanced answer. I can tell you this is the case in survey work on all sorts of issues. So you should always read the question to see, how specific or general is this question. The this is a question we've asked now periodically, which is trade good for the country? Yes, 74% say yes. Does it create jobs? No. No one believes it creates jobs. No one believes it increases wages. And to the bafflement of economists, nobody believes that it lowers prices. I can tell you this year, only in Israel and Sweden do half or more of the population believe that trade lowers prices. So they don't even buy the simple argument that economists make. It is true, though, that the percentage of Americans who say trade creates jobs is up 16 percentage points since 2014. It's up 14 percentage points in terms of just trade raise wages. So we've studied this and done some correlations. Basically, if you believe the economy is doing well, you're more likely to say trade creates jobs than it raises wages. So views of the economy do affect people's views of trade. It just doesn't put it over 50%. This is not our data. It's a Gallup poll, but I love it. They ask people, is this country or that country a fair or unfair trader? Notice that 6 in 10 people say China is an unfair trader. 2/3 of the public say Canada is a fair trader. Half the public says Japan's a fair trader. This is that data over time. And there's multiple years in between, but I just wanted to show the change. In 1993, in the depths of the trade war with Japan, only 24% of Americans said Japan was a fair trader. Now over half of Americans say Japan is a fair trader. Notice that Gallup didn't even ask about China in 1993. It wasn't considered significantly important to the global economy. But now only 30% of Americans say China's. My conclusion is the American public can only have one boogeyman at a time, and this boogeyman used to be Japan, and now the boogeyman is China. This is the breakdown by partisanship, though, which is a terribly important issue. Notice that 81% of Republicans in 1993 said Canada was a fair trader. Now only 49% of Republicans say that Canada is a fair trader. Wendy, Danny, other people in the audience could correct me if I'm wrong. The issues with Canada haven't changed that much. There's lumber, there's salmon, there's milk, and so whether you consider Canada a fair or unfair trader, it hasn't changed that much, except that we now have a president who has said that Canada is an unfair trade, a Republican president, and it's driven down the perception of Republicans in the United States. Meanwhile, you have the same with the EU, what's happened. And what's interesting with Japan is that even though both Republicans and Democrats are more likely now to say that Japan is a fair trader, it's Democrats who've gone up much more strongly than Republicans in saying that. You can't also divorce the fact that it's not just a Republican president attacking some of our trading partners and saying they're unfair. I think we have to conclude also that there are Democrats who say, well, if the president's attacking them, then I'm for it. That partisanship affects these attitudes. This is a question that NBC Wall Street Journal asked this summer. Fascinating result. About half the American public say tariffs are bad for the economy, but look at the partisan difference. By 2-to-1, Republicans say tariffs help the economy. By 7-to-1, Democrats say tariffs hurt the economy. Is this about tariffs and trade, or is this about your partisanship, your tribalism? I'll leave that conclusion to you. Finally, views of China. People are split in Europe, positive in Russia towards China. There are pockets of favorability for China in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Majority of Indonesians, Filipinos have a positive view of China. Australians are really split right down the middle. South Koreans, and especially the Japanese, are negative towards China. We've run a correlation because we had this question about human rights in China. And what is interesting is it is a very strong driver of attitudes towards China, that in terms of Chinese soft power, what really hurts them is the perception they don't protect the civil liberties of their own people. And notice it is particularly strong in Europe. And I can tell you we've done this analysis a couple of different years. And I know last year, for example, the strongest driver of anti-Chinese sentiment in Europe was the perception of China's human rights record. So the Chinese may not care about the perception of their human rights record, but it does affect their overall perception in the world. This is a question we ask this year, which is, and we've asked it a number of times, what are the biggest issues and biggest concerns you have about China, of the American public? And what's interesting is this year it was the large amount of American debt held by China. And notice the U.S. trade deficit is down at 48%. Now, for those of you who are economists, know those are mirror images of each other. But it's the perception that China is our creditor, which seems to be an even stronger concern among Americans than the fact that we have a trade deficit, even though, as I say, they're roughly the same thing. Cyber attacks from China has come out of nowhere. When we first started asking, we didn't even ask about cyber attacks in China. And then when we began to ask it year after year, it rose up the ladder and is now a very important concern of the American public. Notice, and every year we ask this, it's the same, tensions between China and Taiwan is the bottom of the list. I dare say when I was growing up, Quemoy and Matsu were issues, and that was going to lead us to war with China. Now, Taiwan is really off people's radar screen in the United States completely, which, I assume the Taiwanese are not terribly happy about that. So that's an overview of some of our data. I look forward to our discussion and your questions and comments. Thank you.
Okay, if we could turn the searchlights off, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for that, Bruce. It's always useful to go back to the fundamentals of where global public opinion stands. However well-informed or ill-informed our respective public opinions might be, the politicians of the world pay attention to this stuff because they're finding similar conclusions in their own domestic political market research. So that's why it is such a useful tool. And before I begin our discussion, Bruce, thank you so much for being a good friend to the Asia Society Policy Institute in Washington. Yeah. I know you've known Wendy since the early Mesolithic period, but we really value the fact that in our Washington operation, you have been such a willing and friendly supporter of our efforts there and been a participant in so many of our events. So thank you. If I look at, let me just ask a series of questions which present themselves from the data, or as we say in this country, the data. You know what I found interesting as I looked across Asian views of the United States, of President Trump, I should say. How do you explain the Philippines as being such a leader in pro-Trump sentiment? I know the nature of Duterte's domestic appeal. I'm heading off again to the Philippines in a few weeks. But the translation of that sentiment in a positive direction for President Trump as a standout, frankly, across Asia. Yeah. You got any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the short answer is no, because, one of the dirty little secrets of public opinion polling is you don't know what the respondent was thinking when you ask them a question. And to be honest, they don't know either. In the Philippines, we do these surveys door to door. Somebody comes knocking, a stranger comes knocking on your door and says, I'd like to ask you a few questions. What do you think? Do you have confidence in President Trump? And first off, you have to, some people are going to say, I don't know who this is. But they haven't laid awake nights thinking, well, if somebody comes and asks me about President Trump, what do I think? Yeah. So it's an emotional response, not a rational response, which is fine because people vote on emotion. They go into the marketplace and buy a red car rather than a blue car purely on emotion, even though it's the same exact car. So we should honor that emotion. But I think it's inescapable that the fact that Duterte is a strong leader, it would be a soft way of describing it, and the president is a strong leader, has maybe some resonance with the Philippine people. It's interesting that the confidence in the U.S., favorability of the U.S. and the confidence in the U.S. president is so high in the Philippines, given our checkered past and our history.
It was your one colonial foray in Asia.
Yeah,
and,
yeah, exactly. And
which
the
is
fact that
almost unmentionable in
we were kicked out of
conversations here.
Subic Bay, and I mean, there's been some tensions in that relationship for years now. Maybe, I mean, even before Duterte, there was some sign, in at least my perception of it, that things were getting a little better between the Philippines and the U.S. The Philippines maybe were kind of understanding the importance we could play with them. What is interesting, it seems to me, is the Philippine relationship with China, which, if I'm not mistaken in our data, their perception of China has gone up, and the positive perception has gone up. So, whereas I think at one point I would have looked at our data and said, oh, the Philippines realized that we are the protector of them against China, that maybe that's beginning to change a little bit as they kind of realize geography is destiny for them and they have to deal with China. But again, we don't know that, and we don't know why the respondents might have said that. But there's movement in the data which might suggest that.
The flipping to the Americas, the Mexico data was kind of breathtaking. I've spent a bit of time in Mexico City, but not hugely familiar with the country, though I am familiar with the history, which is complex with the United States of America. Just looking at the longitude.
So far from God and so near to the United States.
That's very funny. If you looked at it over time, where were Mexican attitudes under Obama? Can you reflect on that? How's it traveled over time?
They were much more positive under Obama. If you look at a line graph of favorability of the U.S. and confidence in the U.S. president in Mexico, you see the same thing that you see in all over Europe in particular, and to a certain extent in Japan, where there was a steady decline under Bush. Remember, when Bush became president, there was this expectation that he would have a Latin American focus. He spoke Spanish. He'd been governor of the state of Texas, which is on the border of Mexico. And I remember vividly people saying to me, well, finally America's going to pay more attention to Latin America because we have a president who finally understands the importance of Latin America to the United States. And so I think there was maybe some frustration there when that didn't happen. So there was a steady decline, then a jump up under Obama, some decline then, because people kind of he didn't live up to all their expectations, and then this collapse in Mexico as well. I mean, it's interesting. There is a volatility there, and I think we have to accept the fact that whatever the opinion of the U.S. and the U.S. president is now, it could come back, in part because publics do engage in what I think is a fair thing to say is unrealistic expectations. When Obama was elected in 2009, we asked people all over the world, what do you think of this new guy? What do you think he's going to do? And people said he's going to end climate change, not deal with it, end it. He's going to solve the financial crisis. He's going to bring peace to the Middle East. And I remember giving lectures back in 2009 and saying, have you ever heard of the U.S. Congress? Do you have any idea how difficult these issues are? So people do engage in wishful thinking about the U.S. president. And I think one of the broader issues that we all have to wrestle with, and there's no answer here, is do these numbers really matter in terms of the power and influence of the United States or not? And I can give you an argument in either direction. I dare say, the fact that you're all here, the fact that we're here, the fact that we do what we do in our lives, we care about these numbers. We think they're important. And certainly, as you said, Kevin, if you look, say, at the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and the Germans refusing to join with us, or the Turks refusing to join with us, the data in those countries about the support of their populations for that movement, the unfavorability of the U.S., the unfavorability of George Bush, suggested that those democratically elected politicians in those countries would have paid a price if they joined the U.S. in invading Iraq. And they didn't. And so these things do matter, I think, in domestic politics. On the other hand, in Europe, we have asked periodically about NATO and about the willingness to fight, et cetera. And you have a U.S. president who came into office attacking NATO and questioning whether we would actually go to their defense. He did that with Japan and South Korea. The percentage of people who believe the U.S. will come to their defense has actually gone up. The percentage of Americans who say we're willing to go to the people's defense has gone up. And the percentage of people who have a favorable view of NATO has gone up both in Europe and the United States. So you could argue it doesn't matter what the president says. People have their views, and they're actually fairly positive. So I think that we just have to wrestle with how important this is, what meaning we give to this. I think it's terribly important to understand it, but its importance will help us figure out, can we bounce back from this or not? I mean, because that's the ultimate question is, at some point in 2 years or 6 years, we'll get a new administration, and do things bounce back or do they not?
It's interesting what you say about the correlation between the views of various national publics around the world towards the nation as opposed to the leader of the time.
Yeah.
And where I find that most stark is in your data on Japan, which remarkably, the perceptions of the US president were as bad under Bush as they now are under Trump, and then went to stratospheric heights under Obama, who most people around the world, apart from solving climate change, then expected to walk on water. But when he didn't walk on water or solve climate change, he still remained remarkably popular around the world. So interesting stuff. But you look at the correlation line about Japanese deep views of America, they've essentially remained constant. Yeah. I just looked at it again. Favorable view of the United States back in 2002 in Japan, 72% of Japanese. Favorable views of Japan today, of the United States and Japan today, 67. Now that's kind of almost within the margin of error.
Yeah, absolutely.
So do you find this generally across your survey countries that people who are used to being polled within their own countries about political figures will follow, as it were, the trend line of their domestic reflection of the international debate and carry into their countries the tonalities of the American domestic debate, but their deep view of what this country stands for remains constant. So
no, I agree with you. I think, for one thing, we see that confidence in the U.S. president and favorability of the U.S. track each other, but we believe that it's the confidence in the U.S. president that drives things rather than the favorability is less changeable, and that it's when the confidence in the U.S. president goes up, then it's the favorability of the U.S. goes up, and not the reverse. And we've asked a question not this year, but periodically about Americans. Do you have a favorable view of Americans? And frankly, that has been consistent throughout the Bush and Obama and Trump years, where people basically are much more likely to have a favorable view of Americans than they do of the U.S. or of the U.S. president. It is interesting in 2005, after Bush was reelected, we asked people all over the world, do you think more or less of the American people now that they've reelected the U.S. president? And basically people said we feel less good about the U.S., about the American people because they did this. So they sometimes do make a connection. But the underlying issue that I think you get at is does our soft power remain strong? Okay, the image of American people is one of our soft powers. I think it remains strong. This issue of do we protect the human rights of our own people, that's getting worse. We ask people about the American way of democracy. Do you feel good or bad about that? And what's interesting is in Asia, people feel pretty good about American-style democracy. In Europe, less than half the public feels good about American-style democracy. Now, again, we don't know what aspect of American-style democracy people like or don't like, or how much knowledge they have. And we've actually been struggling with how to ask people more in-depth questions. You know, is it you just don't like the outcome? You know, or is it you don't like how much money is in the American political system, or you've seen some American television ads and you're appalled that people are allowed to show those things on TV? I mean, what is it that you like or don't like? But again, our self-perception of ourselves is that our mock democracy is that shining city on a hill, and everybody should aspire to have a democracy like ours. And I can tell you, yes, in Africa, yes, in large parts of Asia, Not so much in countries that know us better, like Canada or Europe. So again, it varies depending on what aspect of American soft power one is thinking about.
In my experience of mature democracies is the people love democracies until they make the wrong choice. And,
right.
And then they turn to the Chinese and say, what an efficient system that is.
Yeah.
So,
We can actually get roads built. We don't have to, get people's permission.
People in democracies can be a little fickle in my experience, but that's just life. On the favorability ratings around the world towards China and the United States, as we slide our way towards what feels more and more like a bipolar world, a G2 world, then if you're sitting in the United States policy planning staff and looking at your data, which as of 2018, frankly has the approve, disapprove of these two countries fairly similar.
Neck and neck,
Yeah. Unfavorable towards China, 43% of the countries surveyed. Unfavorable towards the United States, 43% of the countries surveyed. Favorable, 45% for China and 50% for the United States. And again, how have you seen that evolve over time?
Well, what's interesting is we certainly saw a hit to the perception of the U.S. as the world's leading power, economic power in particular, during the economic crisis, especially in Europe. It's lingered in some countries, even to today, but it's bounced back in others. I think that people see in our data, at least, that China plays a bigger role. What we don't know, and again, it's the limitation of public opinion research, and if you had more time or more space, or you could do focus groups, when people say that they see China playing a bigger role in the world today than they did 10 years ago, which people overwhelmingly do, we don't know whether they think that's a good thing or a bad thing. Obviously, at least some of them probably think it's a bad thing. But it does suggest that China is perceived as a rising power. What would be interesting is if we could survey in China is to see if the Chinese see themselves in that role or not. When in the past, when we've been able to survey in China, and there were slightly different questions, there was this sense that the average Chinese public, and remember, this is we surveyed the entire country of average people, did not see their role in the world the way the world saw their role in the world. And it wasn't that they were down on China or they weren't proud of China, but there was this sense that they weren't the power that everybody thought they were, which, frankly, I wasn't surprised at. I mean, I think that it's a nouveau power. People tend to have a perception of their own role that may be 10 or 20 years old, just because that's when they formed their worldview, and so it probably takes some time for people to understand their own kind of sense of power. I think the interesting thing will be to watch, in particular, views of China in Europe, where when we've asked in the past, in the U.S. and Europe, what do you fear most, Chinese economic power, Chinese military power? Americans were roughly tied, or maybe even a little more worried about Chinese military power. Europeans had no worry about Chinese military power for understandable reasons. I mean, they weren't exposed to it in the same way the U.S. is. But there's this rising...
Europeans had finished using military power in Asia and they didn't care anymore.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. But they have rising tensions with China on economics issues. Growing, at least elites tell us, growing concern in Europe about Chinese investment. And so I do think that the European perception of China, which was really different at one point from the American perception of the economic challenge posed by China, that both at the elite level, and that's just anecdotal, but at the public level too, there seems to be a growing convergence of perception. Now, whether that leads to cooperation or not, which is what a lot of people talk about, I think remains to be seen, because obviously the devil would be in the details of what kind of cooperation one would be willing to engage in.
The we just talked about the favorability ratings of
Yeah.
these two great countries, as perceived by public opinion in the other countries that you've surveyed. But when you harden up the question, which you do, I think, intelligently in the next set that you ask, okay, you might have a favorability view or an unfavorability view, but let's just probe that one further, folks. And you say, who would be better to have as the world's leading power?
Yeah.
And so I might have a benign view of Chinese blue and white porcelain. I might have a benign view and positive view of the Beijing Olympics. But on the question of who would be better as the world's leading power, globally the response is 63% the United States, 19% China.
Yeah. And I do think that, certainly the American audiences that I have shared that's heartening to Americans. Yeah, okay, they don't like our soft power the way they used to, and they don't like Trump, and they see China on the rise. But if you have to choose, they still would prefer the United States. So it'll be interesting to see whether that number ever changes over time, right? Because that would be an interesting indicator. And just as an anecdote, I was in Europe last week and in Brussels, and someone at the European External Action Service, which is the European Union's foreign ministry, said, well, you should have asked whether people wanted Europe to lead the world. And I kind of chuckled and said, I didn't think that there would be a lot of support for that. And it turns out they claim they've actually done this in like 15 countries. And what was interesting in their survey was they said, we found some strong support for people wanting Europe to play a more leading role in the world. But then we ask a follow-up question, do you think the European Union has the capability to do this? And nobody thought they had the capability to do it, which was, I thought, illuminating.
Perceptive.
Yeah, perceptive, exactly. Yeah.
Well, the ultimate on the China question, it's fascinating. The bifurcation of European opinion between China economy good,
Yeah.
China military, we don't give a damn,
Yeah.
through to China human rights gives us some angst depending on how the economy
Yes.
matrix is going.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the summary of the European worldview.
Yeah, yeah,
in
yeah.
my view.
Yeah.
Which in terms of European global leadership poses some questions in my view. Certainly when I've addressed the NATO Council and others on the question of what do you think about security in East Asia, the general response is how much money is to be made there. So anyway, don't get me started on that one. On soft power, which I'm trying to go to this kind of matrix of here's a favorability rating of the world towards the United States and China. Then you've got who would you like to lead the world, and how do you feel about that, where it really sharpens up. And the drivers of that sentiment in terms of favorability and desired leadership position seems, if I'm reading it correctly, is driven by soft power perceptions.
Yeah.
And what you see here is a continuing negative view of Chinese soft power, driven, it seems, primarily by human rights considerations in your analysis. So China on this matrix remains kind of static. But the alarming thing is that the perception of the United States on the soft power thing is taking a hit.
Yeah.
And so that the greater correlation or the closer approximation favorability ratings is not because China's necessarily improving in its soft power image, but the United States is declining. Is that a fair analysis of the data?
Well, I think, we have asked other soft power questions, but one of the reasons I emphasized this one was because the human rights one seems to be the most salient, as you suggest. Other soft power questions we've asked, you get kind of equal ratings of the U.S. and China, but we're not sure that they're good questions, frankly. You're not going to ask people what they think about the Chinese democratic system, so that's one question you can't compare it with. And we ask people about Chinese economy, and people feel pretty good about the Chinese economy for the most part. They feel pretty good about Chinese science and technology products, just like they do the U.S. I wrote that question, and I now consider it a horrible question because, you get an equal. I know when we asked it, we thought we wanted to see whether people perceived America as like the cutting edge of technology, and we're doing the really cool new stuff. And people said, yes, we like American science and technology. And then they equally like Chinese science and technology in places where I realized that, like Africa or some parts of Latin America, that maybe we're just picking up the fact that they have a Chinese-made refrigerator and it works, you know, not that the Chinese make the coolest new computer chips, which is what we were intended to elicit from the question. So we don't have some other measures of Chinese soft power, although we did ask about Chinese cultural products. And again, you don't know what people are thinking when you ask them that question, but there's pretty strong support for Chinese cultural exports, cultural products, which I thought, okay, you know, we may underestimate that. I know when and other people have asked about Japanese cultural products back in the day, but we're talking back in the 80s or 90s. I think we Americans underestimated the influence of Japanese cultural exports to Southeast Asia, for example, and the popularity of some aspects of Japanese culture, and how that can help. I was convinced it helped the Japanese overcome some of the resentments about lingering resentments of World War II.
And finally, on this question of popularity, well, favorability, second, preferred U.S. leadership or Chinese leadership, and third, of which soft power is a driver, but third, what's actually happening in Asia. And this is fascinating for me. If you look at the data about the preference for U.S. leadership in Asia today, it is huge in preference to the United States, despite the fact that China is the dominant economic partner for every country in East Asia. By a country mile. Japan, 81% prefers US leadership. Philippines, 77, South Korea, 73, Australia, 72. Even if you flip down to Southeast Asia, Indonesia, 43, that's still double the number for the number of Indonesians who'd prefer Chinese leadership, 22. So despite everything, you know, despite all the, let's call it the rolling political debate about President Trump and his own low ratings around much of the world, when push comes to shove and you ask this question in Asia about preference for US leadership, it says we in the region, leaving aside soft power questions and leaving aside our core economic interests, which are now overwhelmingly tilted in China's favor, still, in an overwhelming majority, prefer U.S. leadership.
Yeah, and in other surveys that we've done in the past, I mean, you could see that Southeast Asians, for example, were far less concerned about China than Northeast Asians, for historic reasons, maybe for economic reasons, and that was despite the kind of growing concern about the South China Sea, and a bit of geography. So I do think that, in a way, the continued strength of support for U.S. leadership across Asia suggests that you know, all is not bad here for the United States in the region, and you know, and it comes at a time when the South China Sea issues have kind of calmed down a little bit, and so you know, you would think that if people were really worried about that, it could drive more desire for U.S. leadership, but you have that strong desire for U.S. leadership without that. So it's kind of interesting result as well.
Yesterday I spoke at the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, and I described Southeast Asia as center ground zero for the new great game. That is for competing U.S. and Chinese influence, given the intersection of all these matrices, a relative softness of American standing in the region, and because the economies are much smaller than those of Northeast Asia, a much bigger Chinese economic footprint, and frankly lesser concern domestically about human rights performances domestically within China. So if you're reading those survey findings about Southeast Asia and sitting in the Central Committee today in Beijing, you'd say, this is something we can work with. Two final questions before I flip to the floor, and these are just methodology questions, really. One, India's not in your survey. And I think I know the answer to that, but tell us why.
Well, no. Actually, the Indian survey this year, for reasons we're still trying to sort out, on international questions, we got a series of answers that were more than 50% don't know. And so on the domestic questions, I mean, and you always get higher don't knows on international questions than domestic questions, simply because average people, are more, they have opinions about Modi or they have opinions about the economy that they maybe not have about Donald Trump. But the numbers were so high, we've just decided we can't report these on the international questions until we figure out why this is. Because the domestic questions didn't seem to vary that much. Now, I can tell you that even my low expectations of people's knowledge of some of these international issues was shaken when I was in rural Rajasthan in last December. And I had a little kind of mini focus group in this village in the middle of nowhere outside of Jaipur. And
I've got this mental picture of you doing this focus group.
No, so we're sitting around in a circle. And of course, the women weren't allowed to sit in a circle, but we had to talk to them separately. And there were about, I don't know, a dozen guys sitting around in a circle. And they all, are farmers or they worked in the city and commuted because it was about an hour and a half or 2 hours outside of Jaipur. And they all had cell phones, remember. So they were theoretically connected to the world. And so one of the questions I asked him was, well, what do you think, have you guys ever heard of Donald Trump? Remember, he was already been president, right? And only 3 of the dozen had ever heard of Donald Trump. And one of them said, well, isn't he the guy who has 3 wives? And I didn't want to break the guy's heart and tell him that, no, he doesn't have them at the same time. They were sequential. But so we've had very low, but and hopefully we'll be able to report at least the domestic side of the India question, because the Indian results in the past have been fascinating. I mean, in our surveys going over the last 3 or 4 years, I mean, Modi's reputation has gone up and up and up. Perceptions of the economy has gone up and up and up. Now, some domestic Indian polls suggest things have turned a little bit, not horrifically for Modi or for the economy, but, maybe people are getting a little less enthusiastic. But we will hopefully have some Indian results by December or January.
And lastly, on China, you were doing surveys for 16 years in China until 2 years ago, and that ground to a halt.
Yeah.
What happened? And when you were having, prior to the surveys not proceeding a couple of years ago, when you were doing similar Rajasthan-type events in China, surveying Chinese views of the world, what were they like?
Well, what was fascinating, I thought, in the China surveys, and as you mentioned, Kevin, I mean, I would say probably initially I was like, why are they letting us survey in China? And then I realized that, because we were told our surveys circulated at the very highest level, so in the Central Committee and so forth. And I had Chinese officials tell me this. Okay, but I think it was probably because they do their own surveys, and there was a quality control issue, pure and simple. Are these guys, these Americans, finding the same thing we're finding? And if we're not, we got to figure out what the difference is. And what was interesting is while we were not allowed to ask certain questions, like we couldn't ask about the leader, we couldn't ask about the Communist Party, we were able to ask almost every other question we ask all over the world. So we would every year ask, what are the biggest domestic problems facing China? And every year, people would tell us the same 3 things: inequality, corruption, and pollution. And I remember thinking at the time, what is a more damning indictment of the Chinese government than inequality and corruption are the 2 biggest issues that people think are facing the country year after year after year, right? But they seem to, find this useful. Then last year, we were told, well, every time we tried, we were getting a different answer, but basically it was, you have a new NGO law, we have a new data law, we have the upcoming, all-party Congress, and so you can't survey. And this year, we just can't survey. I mean, those excuses seem to have gone away. But I mean, those of you who work in China, I think, know better than I do that working with Western NGOs has become more and more difficult for the Chinese, and it's more difficult for NGOs to kind of be engaged in China. So we'll keep trying, and hopefully they'll relent and we'll be able to do things. But it's a big loss, because we would ask the Chinese, what do you think about the United States? So we could compare U.S. views of China with Chinese views of the United States. And what was fascinating in those surveys, I just found it fascinating, is we both had the same kind of issue. If you tracked Chinese views of the U.S. over time, it's the same as U.S. views of China over time. It was like a sine curve. Views favorability would go up, and then it would go down for a few years, and then it would go up for a few years, then it would go down for a few years, and it was a perfect sine curve. And in both countries, which led me to the conclusion that there was a segment of the Chinese population that would never like the United States. And there was a segment of the population of China that would always like the United States. And similarly in the US, but in reverse. And you just kind of bounced back and forth between, depending on kind of current events, which was somewhat encouraging, I guess. That it would get bad but not horrible, and when it got good, you had to realize it would come back down again at some point. And on issues that were really of interest to the globe, I mean, for example, we did a survey right before the Paris climate conference, and Chinese public concern about the climate change and the need to get something done in Paris, and we asked 7 or 8 questions about various aspects of climate change. Chinese public was fairly aware, low don't knows, and had very strong and very kind of proactive opinions about getting something done, as did the Indian population, by the way. And I vividly remember briefing the French team that was going to be running the Paris climate conference, and highlighting the Indian results, because the Indian population was really worried about climate change. And the French ambassador in charge of the conference looked up from the data and said, "That's not what the Indian government's telling me. I have to bring this up with them." So these things can have actually some useful benefit, it seems to me.
I like the sine curve in terms of Chinese perceptions. We call it the Bruce Stokes yin-yang sine curve on perceptions of America over time. Ken Cordes, you got a question there.
Yeah. The Indians are very rational, right? 9 of the 10. The Indians are rational. 9 of the 10 most polluted cities in the world are in India.
Yeah.
So you can see the contradiction about the Philippines. Remember, the slogan in many Filipino demonstrations is "Yankee, go home and take me with you." I have 2 questions of method I wanted to ask you, because listening to you, I had the impression that you were saying almost that people's attitudes are random, whereas I tend to think that if we go deep enough into the structure of thought, we can find that structure, and they aren't random.
Yeah.
They fit into a coherent pattern. I mean, there's some randomness, but it fits into a broad pattern. So I wanted to think, maybe now is not the time to think about that, but that's important, I think, for what we're talking about here. Secondly, and Kevin and you touched on it at the end, it would be really interesting to see a juxtaposition of attitudes of various countries. The same type of questions in Germany as we have, and then see where it goes. Thirdly, question of data, I thought really important. A number of countries, let me just name them: France, Canada, Germany, UK, Italy, Mexico, have all seen a similar deterioration in perceptions of the U.S. Independent of Trump. I mean, with Trump it's accelerated, but it was very bad under Bush, and it didn't rise as high in those countries under Obama. Even in the period when Obama could walk on water and the UN gave, or Nobel people gave him the prize before he did anything, probably now want to take it back. But how do you explain that the core allies of the U.S. have this steady 20, 25-year deterioration in all levels of image of the U.S.?
Yeah. I guess, well, 2 things. One is, I would never use the word random. What I use the word is emotional. And I think there is a coherence to people's emotions. And I think that I've tried to stress in lectures I do that I remember when I was a journalist, and I wanted a rational explanation for why people thought this. People believe, vote their self-interest, and we should all kind of try to understand how they see their self-interest. And I'm more and more convinced that, we can't assume that people vote their self-interest. They vote their emotions, and that's okay. But we need to understand their emotions, and we need also to understand that human beings are infinitely capable of holding mutually contradictory emotions at the same time. When you think about yourself, right? I mean, you're angry at your spouse and you love your spouse. You're angry at your kids, you love your kids at the same time. And in these data sets, you can see in the same survey that people say, trade's good for the country and it's bad for me. Now, that's not necessarily irrational, but at the superficial level, people say, well, how, they just said trade was good. How could they say it doesn't create jobs, doesn't raise wages? Well, because it's a different question, and people can hold contradictory emotions at the same time. I guess, Ken, I would dispute with you a bit. I think that there has been less of a deterioration over time. There's just been the proclivity to have it deteriorate very strongly among our allies, especially people who know us the best, it seems to me. Then this jump up in support for Obama in the United States in 2009, it kind of, wended its way down a little bit, but still well over 50% in all those countries. Actually, many of the countries kind of bounced back in the last year of Obama and then fell off a cliff again. It was most pronounced in Europe. It was less pronounced in Japan, or I'd have to go back and look at the Mexico data, but you saw the same pattern. I think it was less pronounced. So on one hand, I don't disagree with you completely, but I do think that the striking pattern over time among those people who know us the best, arguably, is this volatility and this, the broader question is, does it bounce back again at some point? Frankly, we just don't know the answer. Wait and see. How often does this pattern repeat itself? We just don't know.
Further questions? Susan.
Question on building on whether you agree or disagree with the volatile period. If you look at after World War II, I suspect the ratings were higher if there were any ratings taken because we were rebuilding the countries. Mm-hmm. So of course it would be high. Yeah. And then as they developed, I'd love to say that we all have the same agenda. We don't. So what really is an appropriate and realistic level that we should expect in a series of developed countries?
It's a good normative question for you as a quantitative pollster.
I'm not the right one to answer that question. I don't think we know, basically. We don't know from the data. I think, your premise is, I think, an accurate one. The world is constantly changing, and why should we expect that the perception of the U.S. is going to stay stagnant and not change as well? Certainly, to the extent that people compare us to something else, right after World War II, there was nothing to compare us to. Europe was flat on its back, Asia was either undeveloped or flat on its back, and the rest of the world was too. But now you've got China, and now you've got at least a stronger Europe than you did in post-war, much stronger Japan, et cetera. But you're right. I think that if you formed your worldview as I did in the 50s, and so you implicitly assume a certain presence in the world for the U.S. based on that experience, and we all know from psychological studies that people kind of carry parts of their psychological worldview with them for their entire life once it's formed, that it does maybe help explain why over and above the economics part of it or the reaction to change part of it, when people say, well, make America great again, in part it's, make America respected around the world in the way it used to be again. Your question is that even possible in a relative sense? What is interesting in our domestic polling is that the percentage of Republicans who say we are less respected has gone from 70% in the last part of the Obama administration to only 40% today. So it's come down 30 percentage points in terms of Republicans think we are now more respected around the world than they used to think. And in fact, the data is just the opposite, right? We were quite well respected under Obama. We are not well respected under Trump. But they like Trump. So again, I think we can't dismiss the fact that people in the U.S. increasingly are tribal in their views. And if my guy's in the White House, then everything's fine with the world. We did a wonderful set of surveys in October of 2016. Only 30% of Republicans thought that the economy was doing well in October of 2016. By February or March of 2017, 60% of Republicans thought the economy was doing well. The economy hadn't changed that much. And more importantly, we asked people in October, is life today better or worse than it was 50 years ago? And Republicans said, oh, it's worse today than it was 50 years ago. And by February of 2017, Republicans said, oh, life is better today than it was 50 years ago. 50 years ago hadn't changed. So again, I mean, one of the problems with one of the observations one has about American public opinion today is how incredibly partisan it is.
A comment I make, and then going to the next question, I think you might have one, Lulu, if I'm catching your eye correctly. I've been reflecting on Vice President Pence's speech on China at the end of last week. One of the things which I think Washington needs to be very mindful of, given all the data sets that you've produced, is this, and going directly to Susan's question, is you can argue a robust view of China by the United States based on American interests and based on American perceptions and conclusions about its own value set. The missing element in the Pence speech, as I observe it, is an appeal to a global set of interests and a global set of values and a defense of the global rules-based order.
Yeah.
And therefore, when America did what it did with the Marshall Plan, and did what it did in Asia, and did what it did through the Peace Corps Plus, it created intergenerational, shall I say, deep imaging in the cerebral cortex and the almost the amygdala type responses in the psychology of the world's view of America, which it was about American interests, but it was about something bigger, which you guys call the light on the hill, and people around the world would use a term in varying shades of grey of the light on the hill. So a cautionary observation just from me is America frames its view under the Trump administration about China. Making America great again in relation to China is one thing. Mm-hmm. The appeal to global public opinion in terms of global interests and global values is and the global rules-based order is given where America has come from since 1945, is also an essential part of the kit.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just a big, powerful state.
And just to follow up on that, I mean, remind us that basically we found that people are more likely to say we're more unilateralist today than we used to be, and we're less engaged with global problems than we used to be, which I think reinforces what you just said.
Lulu.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Bruce, for a fascinating analysis. I had just two questions, more on methodology. One, I was wondering why the Middle East is not included in the survey. It's a small population base, but also very important geopolitical base. Yeah. So that's the first question. The second one, also methodology, is that how do you, in your administration of your survey, try to arrive at a good balance of gender, geopolitical, economic? Because some of the answers struck me as people who are maybe less educated or unemployed and so forth.
Well, I mean, the short answer for your last question is the demography of the survey reflects the demography of the country. So it varies from country to country. You know, if 30% of the population is over the age of 60, then 30% of the respondents are going to be over the age of 60. If 51% of the population is female, then 51% of the population the survey is going to be female. It's geographically spread out over the entire country, including in China when we did it. And that's why it takes, for example, in India, it takes 8 weeks to do the survey because it's done in 8 languages, and you have to go out to rural Rajasthan and knock on a door and kind of, interview
and
a couple
get no answer.
And then get no answer. But so demographically, it's designed to reflect the underlying population and the distribution of the population across the country. And in terms of educational levels or income levels, you get this, it's the same demographic design. So yes, in most of these countries, you're going to have probably the ones that are developing countries, certainly, and even emerging markets, you're not going to have a whole lot of educated people, well-educated, highly educated people. And you know, generally you get in responses what you expect, that less well-educated people, lower income people may have different views than better educated people or higher income people on certain issues, basically. I mean, a perfect example is, even though most people in the world don't believe that trade lowers prices, people who have a higher level of education are more likely to say that trade lowers prices than the rest of the population.
And the first, Middle East?
And the Middle East is another sore point this year for us. We encountered problems in Jordan and Lebanon, which we had never before encountered, and as a result, we couldn't survey there. Egypt, we haven't been able to survey in for a number of years because of the danger to our surveyors. We do Tunisia. Turkey's another problem where the data just came back in ways that was so different from last year on so many levels, and we weren't really sure whether it was administered properly. And you know, we're pretty rigorous. If we have thrown out data sets in the past where we were convinced that the contractor didn't do what we were told them to do in terms of, I mean, to give you a perfect example, you contract with survey firms that also do commercial research. I mean, there's not enough interest in global public opinion to keep a survey firm alive in Turkey or India or wherever. So these are people who do commercial surveys all the time, you know. And in a commercial survey, you push the respondent. You know, do you want to buy Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola? Well, I don't know. No, but if you had to buy one, which would you buy, right? And so you push for an answer. Well, in a public opinion survey about politics and policy, I don't know, or neither, or both, is a legitimate answer. So it's a question of, and we instruct people how to do this, we train them how to do this, but did they actually do it that way? You know, and sometimes you'll come back with 0 don't knows. You say, well, there can't be 0 don't knows on a question about some of these things. Or on the other hand, did they not even push them at all, right? And so you got very high don't knows, where and it's incumbent upon them to follow our instructions. It's incumbent on us to make sure they do that, and sometimes we fail in that exercise.
And you experience.
But next year we'll be doing a lot of these countries again because we think we've fixed some of the problems. Yeah.
And your experience in Saudi Arabia was similar.
The Saudis were very interesting. Years ago, when we first started to do these surveys, oh, come on, we want to be in the survey too. Our only constraint is we have to approve all the questions. And the Chinese didn't even get that option, you know. So, I mean, it's.
But you weren't allowed to ask questions about the leadership in China.
We were not, well, yeah, there were limits. But, I mean, for the most part, we made a decision that their limits that they imposed were fairly, anodyne compared to all the other questions we could ask. Whereas in Saudi, they wanted to approve every question. And we were like, no, we're not going to.
That's different from the past or in line with the past?
Well, we haven't heard from the Saudis since we said no, and that was years ago, so I just don't know. But, I mean, you're right. I mean, the one I really miss in the Middle East is Egypt, because it seems to, it's the biggest country, it's the biggest economy in terms of being a real economy, not just an oil-based economy, and up until recently, very influential and very volatile. So it's really a shame that we can't do. We do Israel, but we need to do more in the Middle East, to get back to doing more in the Middle East. I agree with you.
Now we're moving towards time. One further question here, and then we'll wrap it up, I think.
Thank you. I was interested in whether you tested. I was interested in whether you tested people's opinion at the level of welcome of investment. Do you welcome U.S. investment?
Yeah.
Do you welcome Chinese investment?
Well, we're actually thinking about that by country, because in the past, not this year, but in the past, we've asked people about foreign investment, and we actually asked about 2 kinds of foreign investment. foreign investment where a foreign company comes and buys a local company, or foreign investment where what would be called greenfield. We didn't use that word, but kind of where they come in fresh and do a build. And what was not surprising, I think, is that people all over the world like greenfield investment more than M&A, foreign-led M&A. But the biggest opponents of any kind of foreign investment were the Japanese and the Germans, the two of the economies that do some of the most foreign investment in the world, right? It was like, and they were against it coming to their country, not, and so it's, to my mind, it highlighted how important culture is in these things, and especially foreign-led M&A, creates culture clashes often, or people are worried that foreigners will come in and lay off a lot of people, or whatever the issue might be. And we're actually thinking next year or soon, at least in Asia, it would be interesting to ask about, how do you feel about U.S. investment, Chinese investment, Japanese investment, Korean investment? Because anecdotally, and this is among elites that you talk to, people have real differences, see real differences. I mean, I remember being in Central America a couple of years ago and asking people, just anecdotally that question. And what was interesting is that people said, if we had a preference, we'd work for an American company, then a Japanese or a Chinese company. I forget what was second. And the companies no one wanted to work for were Korean companies. And I said, why? And they said, because the managers are so harsh.
Could you test the a more micro level, the SOE acceptance?
Yeah, that would
the
be
BRI acceptance.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're actually thinking how to ask about BRI, and the problem is the average people wouldn't know what BRI was, right? And you can't just say, well, how do you feel about the Chinese coming in and building a port for us? Well, it's kind of a loaded question. I doubt. I mean, are you picking up how they feel about building this port, or because China's in the question and it's really an anti-Chinese sentiment rather than a? So we're struggling with how to word the question to be fair, to get a kind of a neutral kind of wording, and in terms of you said BRI. What was the issue? SOE. The question with SOE stuff, it seems to me, is no one would know what SOEs were, right? So you have to kind of ask it more as, how do you feel about investment that is kind of subsidized by the foreign government? In other words, the investor has a less than a market rate interest rate, and I just think our sense has been so far, I think, that it would be too complicated of a question for the average person. They would have never thought about it. And one of the other dangers is that when you ask questions that are quite detailed of the public, because you want to know, is that people don't want to appear stupid. So they might give you an answer, but literally they have no idea what you're talking about. And you got to be wary of that, because you could get a kind of a false positive out of it.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. It's partly based on Ken's question before about how definitive you can be in probing people's rational self-interest / emotional responses to a given set of public policy questions, and how far credibly you can go in the specificity of the question to actually provide you with meaningful insight to the answer of the detailed policy question you want the answer to, without actually kind of almost push-polling it in either the right or wrong direction, because people are either wanting to demonstrate they're smart about something they're not, or because there's an inference as to what the desired smart answer might be.
And I think, Kevin, you were a politician, and I think we know that. I mean, public opinion data is going to give you a plethora of answers. And to my mind, responsible public officials understand the contradictory nature of it, the fact that it doesn't tell us everything because you can't probe too deeply, but bad public leaders cherry pick what they want from the public opinion data and run with it, and good public leaders say, no, this is complex. I have to understand it in its multiplicities of facets, And I'm going to work with this, the fact that people are telling me contradictory things or they're telling me things I don't understand. And I think that's the challenge of public leadership.
Thank you very much. Bruce, this has been fascinating. It's an entirely different angle on international relations than we normally discuss here at the Asia Society. But I think vitally important, not just because of the number of democracies in Asia for whom this now matters, and frankly the number of non-democracies for whom social attitude surveys matters as well in shaping leadership choices. And you've had the world's #1 probing these questions around the world in this current and complex age. Please show your appreciation to Bruce Stokes.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So I want to tell you.